We are sitting in the campus of the Bharati Vidyapith Institute of Environment Education and Research. We have the beautiful nature trail background here, and we have with us Dr. Barucha, Director of the Institute. We will be talking about nature education and sustainability. So thank you, Doc, for agreeing to this discussion. What we'd begin with our discussion is, what is the significance of nature education in the environmental movement in India?
Thank you, Sanskriti. I think I'm going to enjoy this session because it is something that's very close to my heart. If you think of nature education, you can go back into the British era where BNHS actually initiated nature education in the country and brought in this through small groups of students and nature trails and so on. This movement continued through the WWF and organizations like CEE and Bharati Vidyapith, which continued this movement of nature education for a long period of time. In my mind, it didn't really evolve very much. And then it came into a phase where we shifted our emphasis to environment education, meaning that it had a more holistic thing, and this was really triggered by the fact that more and more impacts were growing, especially in urban areas, and effects of pollution, effects of urbanization. This is what I think triggered this move from nature education into more environment education. Unfortunately, the way I think we initially did environment education was really a turn-off, because whereas nature education dealt with empathy and creating a love for nature, environment education, especially for children, made them feel weighted down by the pressure of this whole thing of how bad we are to the earth.
Pollution issues.
And this pollution issue, the doomsday, and that whole thing came out very negatively. And children have come and told us this. And they felt weighted down by this. Come a change again into the newer concepts of ESD, Education for Sustainable Development, which is much more action-oriented. We find that it is a complex issue for especially children to understand the economic, social and environmental concerns and understand their linkages. It's not that it's not proper, it's not that it is not possible. If you do it well, it works and it changes people's lifestyles.
But before we
again,
get into the issues of ESD and SD, I just want your views and what has been really the contribution of nature education itself, because it's very powerful. Yeah. And maybe if you could just recollect over the last few decades, what really has this done?
Well, I think a lot happened to nature education, and this nature education really produced this empathy. Yeah. Around the year 2000, we wrote to members of the BNHS and the WWF, asking them that what triggered them into becoming members of these two organizations. Some of them, of course, overlapped, so we had a problem with the statistics. But a large proportion of them, something like 87%, said early nature experiences. A fairly large percentage said books and individuals who had triggered this, right? Very few said school education or college education, visible, right? And this is very interesting, because then we find that the actual environment education field, which was moving much more into curricular aspects and so on, was it producing that kind of a feeling? So when we talk of feeling, I think nature education is the most powerful tool that you can use. And if you don't have this, then any amount of environment education or ESD that we do today may or may not work. So bringing this trigger factor of nature education is very important. Why are we in fact sitting in the nature trail and talking about this today? I mean,
it's a beautiful location. I would just like to mention that at this, the recent Conservation Congress of the IUCN in Jeju, just 2-3 months ago, they have passed a resolution saying that children, to recognize the right of the child to connect with nature, and that this is very important because we are increasingly, in our urban world, becoming disconnected. So I think the power of nature education and the ability and the opportunity to connect with nature remains a very, very powerful opportunity for educationists, for
Absolutely.
whether it's environmental education or ESD.
Absolutely.
But let's just reflect a little more on the type of nature education which has been happening. To what extent were social and economic sustainability issues there in nature education in India in
Right.
the past?
I think in the past it was nearly non-existent. There was very little that anybody did in nature education. It was primarily taxonomy. It wasn't even talking about behavior of species or linkages to impacts and linkages to development and so on. So this was not really the agenda of the initial way in which nature education was done. Today, of course, it's different. So there were very few linkages to that kind of thing. So if you went on a nature trail, you rarely told people about the landscape as such. You rarely told people about the impacts on the landscape of whatever human activity was going on. You rarely talked of conflict. So this is something that I now believe, and which is something that we are working on just now at Bharati Vidyapeeth, which is saying, how do you reinvent nature education for this purpose? And this is a very, very highly technical type of thing. And in didactics, it becomes a very, very complex issue. So we need to look at how to package this in a more relevant way for today. And that's very important. And we have experimented with this. We have had one of my students going out asking questions about what people learnt in nature trails for different organizations, what different organizations said during nature trails, and so on. And very interesting things have emerged from this kind of a study. We now know that most nature trails are about taxonomy. They don't really go beyond that.
Or ecology.
To a certain extent ecology, but even the ecological linkages are not very strong. It's primarily this is this tree, this is that bird out there, that kind of thing. So we have now developed a sort of a manual on how this can be done better. It's in a very initial preliminary stage of how to go about doing this. But this will go from nature education moving in the field into observations. What sort of observation skills do you need? What sort of observation skills are pushed forward by nature education, by going into a nature trail, and therefore moving into a much wider aspect of what happens in a nature trail with school children? I think this is equally important for adults to understand and school teachers to understand, because that becomes then the base for creating the empathy with which you can move into action in terms of ESD. So that is where the strong linkage comes in.
So are there some examples, like if we went on, say, this nature trail, that how do you actually bring in a social dimension or an economic dimension to what you see around it? You see a beautiful setting, but what's hidden, what's not immediately obvious?
There are many cryptic things that happen in a nature trail. Looking down into detritus and talking about how this detritus actually is so important in trying to recycle nutrients and what actually happens there. Now this is something that you go beyond the taxonomy into looking at functions, into looking at ecosystem functions, into looking at how people use ecosystems, what are ecosystem services. This is a much broader picture of what nature education had. But again, I would like to point out that you don't move away from the empathy and the feeling angle. And I think that is most critical. If you cannot produce this empathy with nature, I don't think we can really get what we want from this kind of an activity. So basically, these linkages have to come out. The impacts have to come out. The threats on species do come out. And this is a very nice way of doing it, because you are not losing this business of love for nature.
Right. So the setting is beautiful, and I guess, through looking at these interrelationships, the systems understanding of ecosystems, but also the human position
angle,
or the human
threat.
human
the conflict issues
role
that come
in,
out.
Yeah.
And
like
the whole of
the
whole
ecosystem
of what-
services ideas,
Yes.
which become
Yes.
maybe in a sense anthropocentric, but perhaps also
no, but also
help-
bringing it back.
Yeah.
Always bringing it back into what is there in nature, which is an asset for human beings.
So, what what are the future kind of perhaps from a pedagogical or a didactics angle? What are the things that educators? What is your advice to us to further develop or investigate into or explore using this?
I think we've tried to do this. We've tried to bring in a certain sort of protocol, but protocols don't necessarily work in this, right? Because you have to be, if you're really going to do this as part of empathy with nature, then you can't just go into a sequential thing of what's going to happen. You're going to turn a rock over and you're going to see what's inside there, or you're going to look below a leaf, or there's a butterfly which is suddenly emerging, which is not normally there. So you can't really say what should people do in a nature experience. But I think it's very important that you are able to ad-lib this. So the nature interpreter has to have a wide view of all this. And if he has a wide view of all this, he is able to get the right things at the right time. And then you can fill in gaps. I very often take children and even my students out, my MSc students out, and I tell them first, just go and sit in what I'm taking them into a nature experience. I just say, sit down quietly and just listen and just feel. And we bring out various things out of this. And children are very, very perceptive. You can actually stimulate them into wonderful insights of nature. And I think that is what needs to be done.
Yeah, but how do we get the educators to then, also have those insights related to society and economy and culture, perhaps? The educator probably also needs to be steeped in or be thinking about and conscious of those linkages that, of course, people have with nature.
I think you need enormous capacity building in this. It depends on what we mean by an educator. Is he environmentally conscious individual himself? What does he do with his own lifestyle? And that kind of capacity building that is required is something that one can really achieve. We have been able to do this with school teachers who have been very afterwards proactive on getting this to happen. And we've had wonderful examples of this. So I think this is very important. I think also, converting that usual school picnic into a nature experience is not very difficult if you select the right site. The other thing is that, which I think is very necessary, which we haven't spoken about today, which is actually developing nature awareness areas. I've been talking about this for years, and this is quite an example of a very small nature awareness area, which we are very successfully using at school level. We are using it for this core module course on environment education for undergraduate students, and it works very, very successfully. So creating a small nature awareness area, of course you get mosquitoes and mosquito bitten and so on, but even my cameraman is scratching his head. So this is something that we can actually develop. Small nature awareness areas can be developed at a village pond, can be developed in a small patch of reserve forest. There are so many things to see
even in the
there.
city.
And of course even in the city. There are green spaces in the city, which one should not make into garden spaces, Lawns and ashoka trees don't make for good nature experiences. And I think this is what is very important. How do you recreate nature in small patches like this, which become very effective tools in bringing out this nature education thing? And here you have my group of babblers, which comes here every afternoon, is right up there, sitting right above you, Saraswati. So this is something that you can always do. I think these are the steps towards more relevant nature education of today.
Thank you.